In 1850, the city of Chicago had a population of roughly 30,000 people. That is the official record, verified, cross-referenced, accepted. By 1856, the city had installed a brick sewer network stretching across 57 miles of underground tunnel, engineered to serve a population of over 300,000. The city would not reach that population for another 2 decades. That gap, between the infrastructure that existed and the population that hadn't arrived yet, sits quietly inside the historical record. Not hidden. Not erased. Just sitting there, waiting to be looked at directly. This documentary examines that gap. Not to prove anything. Not to dismantle anything. But because the gap itself is interesting, and the places it appears are more numerous than most people expect. The people, cities, and engineers discussed here are real. The records are public. What follows is an attempt to look at those records honestly, and to sit with what they show. Chicago's sewer problem began with geography. The city was built on flat, marshy land barely above the level of Lake Michigan. When it rained, the streets flooded. When they flooded, cholera spread. By 1854, a single outbreak killed over 1,400 people in a city of 30,000, roughly 1 in every 20 residents. The city had no choice but to act. Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough was hired as the city's first chief engineer in 1855. What he proposed was audacious. Rather than dig down into the waterlogged earth, he would raise the entire city up. Buildings would be lifted on hydraulic jacks. New street grades would be established several feet above the old ones. And beneath this elevated city, a comprehensive sewer network would be installed, brick-lined, gravity-fed, and built not for the city as it was, but for the city that planners believed it would become. The logic was sound. Infrastructure, especially underground infrastructure, is expensive to retrofit. You build it once, and you build it large. That argument, build large, build ahead, is the official explanation for what Chesbrough designed. And it is, by any reasonable measure, a rational explanation. City planners in the 19th century understood exponential urban growth. They had seen it happen in New York, in Philadelphia, in London. You did not build a sewer for today's population. You built it for the population that would be there when the bricks finally needed replacing. This is the accepted story, and it is well documented. But the accepted story has a number embedded inside it that is worth pausing on. Chesbrough's system was designed, from the outset, for a city of over 300,000 people. In 1856, when construction began in earnest, Chicago's actual population was approximately 84,000. The system was built at nearly 4 times the capacity the city currently required. 4 times. That is not a modest safety margin. A 10 or 20% buffer is standard engineering practice. 50% is cautious. 400% is a different kind of decision, one that implies either extraordinary confidence in future growth, access to projection models far more sophisticated than the era typically produced, or something else that is harder to name precisely. Chicago reached 300,000 residents in 1870, 14 years after the sewer network was installed. By that point, the infrastructure was ready, almost as if it had been waiting. Whether that represents visionary planning or a coincidence on the favorable side of history depends on how you weigh evidence that is, by nature, incomplete. The timing raises questions, not about intent, but about confidence. About what Chesbrough and the city planners believed they knew, and why they believed it with enough certainty to commit millions of dollars of mid-19th century capital to infrastructure built for a city that did not yet exist. Chicago is the clearest example. But it is not the only one. In Cincinnati, the Mill Creek Sewer, constructed between 1843 and 1851, was engineered with tunnel dimensions that engineers at the time described as generous beyond present necessity. The city's population in 1850 was 115,000. The system's design capacity, based on contemporary hydraulic calculations, suggested it was built for a city nearly twice that size. In St. Louis, similar patterns appear in the records from the 1850s. The city's early underground drainage infrastructure, much of it constructed before the Civil War, shows bore diameters and gradient specifications consistent with a population that would not materialize for another generation. These are not obscure cities. These are the major urban centers of mid-19th century America, each of them, in their own records, showing infrastructure that arrived before the population it was meant to serve. The cross-regional consistency is what makes the pattern interesting. If this were one city, it would be one engineer's optimism, one planning committee's ambition, one anomalous decision made in one particular political climate. But Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis, and, as we will examine, cities across the Atlantic, share a structural similarity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. The underground systems they built in roughly the same decades show the same characteristic: capacity that exceeded contemporary need by margins that conventional planning logic struggles to fully account for. Each city has its own local explanation. Each explanation is reasonable on its own terms. But when you lay the cities side by side, the explanations begin to feel like they are describing parts of the same larger pattern, a pattern that the explanations themselves were not designed to account for. That pattern has a name in certain corners of historical inquiry. Not a scientific name. Not an academic consensus term. A name that carries its own complicated history, one that shapes how seriously people are willing to take the evidence it is attached to. Understanding where that name comes from, and what it has come to mean across a century and a half of use and misuse, is the only way to approach what the underground records of the 19th century actually show. At the time of its completion, it connected Albany to Buffalo, 363 miles of engineered waterway cutting across upstate New York. The canal was a triumph. Everyone agreed on that. What they agreed on less clearly was why it had been built at the scale it had. The original proposal, submitted in 1808 by surveyor James Geddes, called for a canal 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Functional. Adequate. Proportional to the traffic that existed at the time. The canal that was actually built was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep at its narrowest, but its locks were 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. Large enough to accommodate vessels carrying up to 75 tons of cargo. In 1825, there were almost no vessels of that size operating in the interior of the United States. The standard explanation is forward planning. Canal Commissioner DeWitt Clinton and his engineers understood that commerce would follow the waterway, and that commerce would grow. Build the locks large enough for the ships that would come, not the ships that existed. That explanation is reasonable. It is probably correct. But the locks were not merely large. They were standardized, every lock along 363 miles of canal built to identical dimensions, with tolerances that required a level of centralized coordination unusual for an era when most large construction projects varied considerably from section to section depending on which local contractor had won the bid. 83 locks. Identical dimensions. Across a project that took 8 years and employed thousands of workers operating in separate teams across hundreds of miles. That level of standardization implies something, a central authority with both the technical capacity to enforce uniform specifications and the long-term vision to understand why uniformity mattered. In 1830, 5 years after the Erie Canal opened, Britain completed its Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity passenger rail line. The railway was 35 miles long. Its stations, from the first year of operation, were built with platforms and waiting facilities designed for volumes of passengers that would not materialize for over a decade. The station at Manchester, Liverpool Road, had a second-floor ticketing hall and passenger galleries that contemporary accounts described as spacious beyond what current patronage demands. The railway carried around 1,200 passengers per day in its first year. The facilities had been designed, by the engineer's own records, with daily throughput estimates of closer to 5,000. It reached that number in 1843. 13 years later. This is the infrastructure before demand pattern, and in the United States and United Kingdom, across the 1820s through the 1870s, it appears with a frequency that is worth examining carefully. It appears in canal systems, in rail networks, in municipal water infrastructure, in the underground drainage systems we have already discussed, and, less visibly, but consistently, in the storage and handling facilities built alongside these networks. grain storage in Chicago, cotton warehouses along the Liverpool docks, coal handling infrastructure in Cardiff. Each of these facilities was built, in the decades before the Civil War and before Britain's industrial peak, at scales that exceeded current commercial need by margins that, individually, can be explained. Collectively, they begin to form a picture. Whether that picture reflects a shared inheritance of engineering philosophy, a convergence of rational planning decisions made independently across two countries, or something that requires a different framework to describe, that question sits at the center of what we are examining. The administrative similarity is harder to dismiss than the physical evidence. When you look at the organizational structures that oversaw these projects, the canal commissions, the railway boards, the municipal infrastructure committees, you find a pattern in their composition. They were not run by politicians. They were not run by businessmen, primarily. They were run by engineers and surveyors whose careers moved, with unusual fluidity, between public and private projects, between American and British contexts, and between sectors that today we would consider entirely separate. William Strickland worked on drainage systems in Philadelphia and also designed the infrastructure specifications for early Nashville. Benjamin Henry Latrobe, usually remembered as an architect, wrote the hydraulic engineering specifications for the Philadelphia waterworks, which were, from their 1801 opening, built to serve a population the city would not reach for 40 years. Latrobe corresponded regularly with engineers in Britain. His papers, held at the Maryland Historical Society, show a professional network that crossed the Atlantic with a regularity unusual for the era. Letters exchanged, specifications compared, construction methodologies shared in ways that suggest a coherent, coordinated body of engineering knowledge operating across national boundaries. This is not proof of anything conspiratorial. Professional networks have always existed. Engineers have always shared knowledge. But the density of that network in the early 19th century, and the consistency of the outputs it produced, infrastructure scaled well beyond immediate need, standardized to unusual tolerances, appearing across multiple cities in multiple countries within overlapping decades, creates what historians call an evidential accumulation problem. Each individual piece of evidence has an explanation. The explanations are good. They are supported by documents. The accumulation, however, is harder to explain away piece by piece. Because the accumulation is the point. Not any single canal, or any single lock, or any single engineer's correspondence. The point is that when you lay these things beside each other, they rhyme. They rhyme in their scale. They rhyme in their timing. They rhyme in their administrative structure and in the professional networks that produce them. And they rhyme, most importantly, in what they were built for, cities and populations and commercial volumes that did not yet exist. Infrastructure for a world that was coming. Or, and this is where the pattern begins to press against a more uncomfortable possibility, infrastructure for a world that had already been, and was being rebuilt. That second possibility has a name. It has been called many things across the century and a half since the infrastructure in question was constructed, but in the last decade it has coalesced around a single label, one that carries enormous interpretive weight and an equally enormous reputation problem. Understanding what that label means, where it came from, and why it generates such intense disagreement is the only honest way to approach what the records, taken together, seem to be pointing toward. It was not a fringe term. It was not a conspiracy label. For several hundred years, Tartaria, or Tartary, in its anglicized form, was the name that European cartographers used to describe the vast interior landmass stretching from the Caspian Sea eastward through Central Asia and into what is now Siberia and northern China. It appeared on maps produced by serious geographic institutions. It appeared in encyclopedias. The 1771 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica devoted a substantial entry to it, describing it as a region of considerable geographic and political complexity. This was not a secret. This was standard geographic nomenclature for nearly 5 centuries. The name gradually fell out of use through the 18th and 19th centuries as European powers mapped the interior of Asia with greater precision, and the territories that had been broadly labeled Tartary were subdivided into more specific regional designations. By the mid-1800s, the word had largely disappeared from formal cartography. That disappearance is, by any straightforward account, unremarkable. Geographic terminology changes. Regions get renamed as understanding improves. The word Tartary faded for the same reason that New Holland was replaced by Australia and Cathay gave way to China. The map got more detailed, and the broad labels became unnecessary. That is the historical record. It is accurate. It is well supported. What happened to the word in the early 21st century is a separate story entirely. Beginning roughly around 2017 and accelerating through the early 2020s, the term Tartaria was adopted by a loosely connected online community as the label for a sweeping alternative historical theory. The theory, in its most developed form, proposes that a technologically advanced civilization, referred to as Tartaria, once existed across large portions of the Northern Hemisphere, including North America and Europe, and that this civilization was either destroyed or suppressed sometime in the 18th or 19th century, with its physical remnants absorbed into the official historical record under different names and explanations. The Victorian-era buildings with their elaborate facades became Tartarian architecture. The oversized infrastructure became Tartarian engineering. The underground source built for populations that hadn't arrived became Tartarian legacy systems, repurposed by a new civilization rising from an older one's ruins. This is where the interpretive problem becomes acute. Because the evidence that points towards something genuinely interesting, the infrastructure anomalies, the administrative networks, the scaling patterns, becomes entangled with a framework that makes extraordinary claims without the documentary support those claims would require. And the entanglement damages both directions. The conspiratorial framing makes the legitimate anomalies easier to dismiss. And the legitimate anomalies give the conspiratorial framing a veneer of grounding it would not otherwise have. The result is a conversation that cannot quite find its footing, where reasonable historical curiosity and unfounded revisionism occupy the same argumentative space, making it difficult to examine either one clearly. Three interpretive models have emerged from this space. None of them is complete. All of them are serious enough to deserve description on their own terms. The first is the rational planning model. This is the mainstream historical position, and it holds that the infrastructure anomalies we have been examining are fully explicable through conventional causes: visionary engineering, economic ambition, professional networks that shared best practices across national boundaries, and the well-documented reality that large infrastructure projects are almost always built with future growth in mind. The Erie Canal, Chicago's SOARs, Liverpool's rail stations, all of it fits within a framework of ambitious but explicable 19th century development. The gaps between capacity and population were real, but they closed. The infrastructure worked. The story holds. This model is supported by the most documentary evidence. It is the default position of academic history, and it earns that position honestly. The second is the catastrophe inheritance model. This position does not require a hidden civilization or a suppressed history. It proposes, more modestly, that the early 19th century followed a period of significant demographic disruption, possibly related to the volcanic cooling events of the early 1800s, including the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora and the year without a summer in 1816, and that infrastructure built before or during this disruption was inherited, repurposed, and integrated into the expansion narrative of the century that followed. The year without a summer is a documented historical event. Crop failures across North America and Europe were real. Population dislocations were real. The argument is not that a civilization was erased, but that the continuity of the 19th century's development story may be less seamless than it appears, that some of what was built, or partially built, before the disruptions of the 1810s was later absorbed into a narrative of fresh construction and new ambition. This model sits in uncomfortable middle ground. It is not supported by specific documentary evidence. But it is also not refuted by the absence of such evidence, because the evidence it points to is largely structural, present in the physical record of what was built, when, and at what scale. The third model is the civilizational rupture model. This is the Tartaria theory in its fullest form, the proposition that a prior civilization of considerable sophistication existed across the Northern Hemisphere, was catastrophically disrupted sometime between the late 18th and mid-19th centuries, and that its physical legacy was incorporated into the official history of the nations that came after it without acknowledgement. This model requires the suppression of an enormous volume of historical record. It requires the coordinated rewriting of cartographic, architectural, engineering, and demographic documentation across multiple countries and over multiple generations. The evidentiary burden is, by any standard, extraordinarily high, and the specific documentation that would be needed to support it has not been produced. But the model persists. And it persists, in part, because the questions it is responding to, the scaling anomalies, the infrastructure patterns, the administrative networks, are real questions. The answers it offers may be unsupported. The questions themselves are not. Which brings us back to 1816. The year without a summer killed crops across New England and Western Europe. In some regions, summer temperatures never rose above what we would now call early spring levels. There were food riots. There were mass migrations. Communities that had existed for generations were abandoned as farmland became unworkable. And then, within a decade or two of that disruption, construction began on infrastructure of unusual ambition and unusual scale: sewers, canals, railways, storage systems, across precisely the regions that had been most severely affected. Whether that sequence represents recovery, as the mainstream account holds, or something more complicated, a rebuilding that drew on knowledge and physical structures that predated the disruption, is a question that the physical record alone cannot answer. The documents we have were produced by the people who built what we can see. They describe their work as new. The metaphor that fits most honestly is archaeology, not conspiracy. When archaeologists find a foundation beneath a foundation, an older structure beneath the one that history recorded, they do not conclude that someone lied. They conclude that the story is more layered than it appeared. That time works in strata. That what looks like a beginning is often a continuation. The underground systems of the 19th century may be exactly what the official record says they are: the bold, forward-looking engineering of a civilization in rapid expansion, built large because the people who built them believed in what was coming. Or they may be foundations beneath foundations, structures whose full story is older, and stranger, and more layered than the histories written above them have so far been willing to say. The evidence invites examination. What you conclude depends on how much weight you are willing to give to what is physically present, against what the written record has chosen to preserve. Both of those things are part of the historical record. They do not always agree. And in that disagreement, quiet, structural, embedded in brick and mortar beneath cities that have long since forgotten they were ever anything other than what they are today, the real question sits. Not answered. Not unanswerable. Just waiting, the way old foundations wait, for someone to look down instead of forward.